Hitler's worried about who? Some Belgian dude with pockets. I'm sorry, come again? Some Belgian dude in the pocket, yeah, I get it. Belgian dude in the, okay, I see. Yep. Wait. Why? Huh. That's his story, huh? Yeah, well, you think he might stay in Belgium. Yeah, okay. Okay, see you. February 11th, 1944. Orders this week about one operation. You gotta break in and reach them, but they're not to break out. Wait. You have to not do that. You have to surround them, even though they've surrounded you. Okay, that didn't work. Now you gotta reach them again. Oh, you can't. Okay, now they gotta break out. I'm Indy Neidell. This is World War II. Last week, the Allies continued landing troops at Anzio south of Rome, but were not only unable to break out of their beachhead, the Germans began counterattacks late in the week. Further south, though, they came ever closer to the Axis fortress of Monte Cassino. A new operation began in the Pacific as tens of thousands of men landed on various Marshall Islands and overwhelmed the Japanese garrison. In the Soviet Union, the Soviet advance in the north prompted Hitler to change his commander, but attacks will continue, as they will against the Korsun Pocket and the Nikopol bridgehead. In the most advanced of the Soviet spearheads this week, the Soviets occupy Rovno and Lutsk on the 5th, pushing back 4th Panzer Army. These have been occupied Polish cities the past few years. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill tells his advisors, "Now that the Russians are advancing into Poland, it was in our interest that Poland should be strong and well supported. Were she weak and overrun by the advancing Soviet armies, the result might hold great dangers in the future for the English-speaking peoples." That may be, but the Soviets are overrunning a bunch of places this week. At the very end of last week, the Soviet Leningrad and Volkhov fronts resumed their offensive in the north. They are trying for an encirclement of German 18th Army forces around Luga. New Army Group North Commander Walter Model can see this, but he also has offensive plans of his own to establish the front along the Luga River and then over to the northern tip of Lake Peipus. Hitler, usually delighted by talk of an offensive, displayed no enthusiasm. In a rare personal directive to Model, he cited the Narva area as most vulnerable and ordered it reinforced without delay. In the sector between Lake Peipus and Lake Ilmen, he saw a danger of 18th Army being pushed east away from Lake Peipus and a threat of an encirclement, and he instructed Model to submit a request for a withdrawal to the Panther position as soon as either of those became imminent. That's pretty striking, Hitler being the voice of caution. We do not see that very often. By the 6th, 12th Panzer Division has closed the gap to 16th Army on 18th Army's flank, though, and is planning to attack east from Lakes Peipus and Pskov. Model has brought in a bunch of his rear echelon troops to the front lines, and making a withdrawal of the front around Luga, which would take a few days, would free up 3 divisions, making the German position a fair amount stronger. Model gives orders the 7th for the beginning of his counteroffensive, first moving units from the north and the east to create a solid front between Luga and the southern tip of Lake Peipus. After that, they'll use a parry and thrust strategy to stop any Soviet advance from Lake Samro, while to the west, they advance up the shore of Lake Peipus. They spend the next couple days trying to get into position, and then it all goes to hell. Yep. Partisan sabotage, swampy terrain, and Soviet units basically filtering past them means that the 58th Division is split in half by today, and both halves are surrounded. They will have to try a breakout and will likely lose all their heavy equipment. As night arrives, 18th Army Commander Georg Lindemann tells Model that the only possible way to close the gaps on the left flank is to pull the whole line back to the shortest distance between Lakes Peipus and Ilmen. Model reluctantly agrees because Leningrad Front Commander Leonid Govorov is driving the right Soviet pincer along the Peipus shore towards Pskov, and he has a lot of armor. Further south, around the Korsun Pocket, the fog that arrived at the end of last week paralyzes movement at the beginning of this one. Inside the pocket, are 6 divisions from 11th and 42nd Corps, though 2 of them are pretty weak. The strongest of them is the SS Viking Division, which interestingly enough contains the volunteer Belgian Brigade Wallonien. Hitler is apparently concerned about the safety of one of the Belgian soldiers, the leader of Belgium's collaborationist Rexist party, Léon de Grelle, who fights here. The units in the pocket do have one less worry than many others on the outside. They happened to be transporting collected food supplies to the Korsun vicinity. So until this week, the only air supply they've needed is ammunition and fuel. This is good because first fog and then snow have kept a lot of planes grounded, and 44 were lost in accidents or shot down here already before this week. German Army Group South Commander Erich von Manstein's relief force is set to go this week, but Adolf Hitler changed their orders a few days ago. Instead of just trying to force a corridor to reach or free the trapped Gruppe Stemmermann, he wants them to try to counter-encircle all the Soviet troops. They do actually try an encirclement when they get moving, but they don't nearly have the armor for it. And by the 8th, both 3rd and 47th Panzer Corps have stopped the attempt. Manstein then tells 3rd Panzer Corps to just try to relieve them then. And that takes 3 days to organize. But by today, both he and his commanders aren't sure whether either of the relief corps can really break through to the pocket. 47th Corps is under attack on its flanks, and though 3rd Corps has a shorter distance to cover to the pocket, they have such problems bringing up gasoline that tank crews are carrying it up to the front in buckets through knee-deep mud that's caused many to go barefoot because it's easier than fetching stuck boots every few meters. I got that little tidbit from Earl Ziemke, by the way. On the 8th, the Soviets offer Wilhelm Stemmermann surrender terms, which are refused. And the 9th, the Germans fly in loads of food, fuel, and ammo to Korsun and evacuate some of the wounded. This because they've managed to build and open a new airstrip there. They start bringing in over 100 tons of supplies a day, which is more than enough. However, by the 10th, Ivan Konyev's relentless Second Ukrainian Front attacks on the pocket have shrunk it to 10 kilometers by 11, and the Soviets close in on Korsun itself. When they take it, in a few days, Stemmermann's forces group in Shandarovka and Steblev. So, 3rd Panzer Corps gets orders to begin its drive to the pocket today, the 11th, no matter what, because 11th Corps inside the pocket that had begun the whole thing with only one really fit division of its 3 is now on the verge of collapse. 3rd Panzer Corps attacks early in the day with more trouble from mud than from the Soviets and nearly reaches the Tikish River, but they fail to reach it by the day's and the week's end. And the Germans begin their breakout a bit before midnight, which surprises the Soviets, and they reach Khilki and Komarivka. One thing I should mention that also happens here this week is that on the 10th, members of the BDO, the League of German Officers, which is part of the NKFD, the National Committee for a Free Germany, a German anti-Nazi organization that operates in the USSR, come to the front. 2 German generals who are part of the BDO and are POWs since Stalingrad, Walter von Seydlitz-Kurzbach and Alexander von Daniels, make personal appeals to the German command. They also broadcast over the radio. These fail, but the BDO do make an impression on both sides. Seydlitz is then dismissed from the army and even sentenced to death in absentia, and if that is not enough, Hitler also orders Sippenhaft against his family, meaning that they share responsibility for his crimes. I am not sure about von Daniels, actually. Let me know if you know. There is also pretty big news from the fighting further south in the USSR this week. After all the many weeks of trying, Rodion Malinovsky's 3rd Ukrainian Front and Fyodor Tolbuchin's 4th finally break the Nikopol-Kryvyi Rog defense system. On the 5th, elements of Soviet 46th Army advance nearly 50 kilometers and storm Apostolovo, which outflanks both Nikopol and Kryvyi Rog, and moreover, gives them the entire contents of German 6th Army's supply base and cuts 6th Army in 2. Then they and 8th Guards Army head west towards the Igulets River. That's from the 3rd Ukrainian Front. From the 4th comes attacks again on Nikopol that finally start to drive the Germans from their bridgehead on the Dnieper opposite the city. Then on the 6th, 3rd Front troops take Manganets east of Nikopol. They also take ground west of Apostolovo, which begins to threaten Nikopol with encirclement. The Axis forces have, however, already begun evacuating, as we saw late last week. So by the 8th, the Nikopol bridgehead is totally cleared, and Soviet 6th Army from 3rd Ukrainian Front breaks into Nikopol itself. German 4th Corps has headed west from the scene, screened by 17th Corps, but the mud and the enemy forced them to a halt today. German Army Group A commander Ewald von Kleist tells OKH tonight that they can patch together a coherent front for the time being, but cannot hold it, since the enemy now has big options. He can attack south to the lower Dnieper or north past Krivoy Rog. Kleist proposes that Army Group A and the right flank of Army Group South pull back to the Ingul River as a prelude to pulling back to the next defensible line, the southern Bu River. But as the Germans are on defense in the Soviet Union, they are now on offense in Italy. On the 7th, they renew attacks against the British 1st Division at Anzio. By the 9th, they've driven British 1st Division out of the town Aprilia, known as the Factory by the Allies, but the British take it back. However, as the week ends, the factory is once again in German hands. Thing is, by now, Eberhard von Mackensen's forces actually outnumber the Allies on the Anzio front some 95,000 to 76,000, and he has ringed the beachhead with 370 artillery pieces. His big counterattack is set to go off next week. You know, Allied Commander John Lucas's attacks last week were only for just a few days and failed, and he has, breaking the timeline, over the years gotten a great deal of flack for lack of audacity or lack of courage or just moving too slow or whatever. Loads of things. And he is certainly in the doghouse by now with Winston Churchill for not storming towards the hills already January 23rd or 24th. But also over the years, there is a growing sense among many that maybe he made the right decisions after all. And looking back, there were those who thought it at the time. Harold Alexander's Chief of Staff John Harding believes Lucas has saved his men there from disaster. 5th Army Commander Mark Clark eventually feels the same. Rick Atkinson writes in The Day of Battle that British General Gerald Templer, who cannot personally stand Lucas, still feels that if the Corps had gone on the offensive right away, within 2 weeks, they'd all be dead or captured. Way in the future, in the year 1950, Alexander himself will say that Lucas's course of action was likely the most advantageous in the situation. Make of this what you will, what ifs are what ifs. There will soon be more fighting there in any case, and there will soon be renewed fighting further south for Monte Cassino. I already mentioned that the Germans have promised that no soldiers would enter the abbey there, but they've fortified everything else in the area since, on Hitler's orders, Cassino is the linchpin of the Gustav defense line. He has also ordered that the best reserves be on the mountain massif. Observations posts and weapons pits pocked the south face. German engineers had acquired every rock drilling machine in the vicinity of Greater Rome. Sappers demolished abbey outbuildings and blew up selected houses in the town to improve fields of fire. More bunkers, pillboxes, and steel dugouts pocked the landscape. By late January, rear echelon units and civilians alike had fled the town, leaving only combat killers in their subterranean lairs, with orders to stand or die. Stray shells have been hitting the abbey since mid-January, though, and there's also an issue with refugees. Like this week on the 5th, an artillery barrage sends 40 frightened women banging on the abbey's gate to get in. Though they are at first turned away, they apparently bang on the gate until their knuckles bleed, and then the gate is opened. They rush in, but soon hundreds more follow, and makeshift encampments are made all over, including 400 people camped out on the abbey's grand staircase. Well, in the first half of February, the Allies make 3 big efforts to break the final mile there into the Liri Valley, but they all fail. Today, the 11th, 1,500 grenades fail to drive the enemy from what they call Albanetta Farm by .593. 8,000 French and 10,000 American casualties tell the general tale. Those fighting formations will soon get some respite, though. Bernard Freyberg's New Zealand Corps has moved over from eastern Italy and joined 5th Army's order of battle. They will join the fighting in the Cassino sector, though not till next week for real. The 4th Indian Division is now here too. They enter the lines tomorrow, the 12th. Gonna backtrack a bit now to pick up another thread. I said a couple weeks ago that the Allies were executing Operation Jail, a deception plan to convince the enemy that their upcoming invasion will not be at Normandy, but elsewhere. They get their first notice that this operation may be working this week on the 9th. They intercept 2 Enigma messages that send German troops in the Balkans to Skopje and Sarajevo to be available in the event of an Allied landing in Greece like the Anzio one. They will also soon get word that the Germans believe the 1st United States Army Group is a real thing. FUSAG does not exist, however, even though it has a commander. At the moment, Omar Bradley, though that will soon change to George Patton. Bases, plans, training grounds, and even a specific target, the French coast between Calais and Boulogne. The Germans will believe that this phantom army is a real threat. There is also the 12th British Army, which only exists on paper, but it's got a motorized division, armor, and even a Polish infantry division. More on all of this over the coming weeks and months. One Allied operation that very much exists is the aerial campaign to neutralize Rabaul. In fact, this week on the 10th, the Allies send in a raid with 275 planes, which is nearly twice the total Japanese garrison strength there. The campaign has been a success. The Japanese send up anywhere from 35 to 85 fighters to fight up each of the raids, and they do shoot down Allied fighters each time, but there are just too many escort planes for them to get to the bombers. And their aerial losses are always equal to or greater than those they shoot down. The bombers, of course, are destroying loads of Japanese planes on the ground, anywhere from a few to 20 each time, and by now, ground losses the past 2 weeks are nearly at 100 planes. The bombs also crater the runways. Dive bombers take out a quarter of the AA guns and more than that of their crews. Things look grim here for the Japanese. And with one more note from that region, on the 10th, the occupation of Huon Peninsula is nearly complete as Australian troops advancing from Sio link up with Americans near Sidor. I will end this week of the war. A week of the Germans doing quite well in Italy, but much less well in the USSR in a variety of sectors. And the enemy believes there's a whole American army group and a British army out there that do not actually exist. But if you believe they do exist, then you prepare to fight them, and that involves moving troops around, as we see this week in the Balkans. Thing is, those troops that are and will be sent to meet phantom menaces are very, very much needed to fight actual menaces, like at Nikopol. Remember, Hitler said it absolutely must not fall because it is a center for manganese, which the Germans need, but fallen it has. Those troops, now moving around the Balkans, would have been useful over there. Oh, what a tangled web we weave when first we practice to deceive, wrote Walter Scott. And he meant, what a domino run of complications, lies, and deception can create. But remember, webs can be very useful and catch all sorts of things. Something else that's very useful, at least to us, is the Time Ghost Army. For that is what finances this series. You can be part of this endeavor by joining the Army at timeghost.tv or patreon.com. These are the newest commissioned officers in the Army. And Lauren Carter is the Army Member of the Week. Speaking of deceptions, we have a whole World War II series that covers the intelligence war on this channel called Spies and Ties, which is hosted by Astrid Deinhard, and you can click right here to see the playlist for that, and you can click subscribe, and I will see you next time.